Drella picks it up, crosses over the goal line, passes it to Rogers. Rogers breaks through two defenders. He winds up, shoots. Tillman gets it with their glove. It's loose in front of the net. Mercier's hacking away, straight into Gerard, and it's in! It's in! They've tied it! This series will be going back to Port Davin for Game 7. And that is the sound of 200,000 screaming fans in the Champlain Arena here tonight.
Even after 2 decades, the goal scored by Justin Gerard in the third overtime Game 6 of the 22-62 OHL playoffs is frequently cited as one of the greatest moments in the history of professional hockey.
Recordings of the event, though dated, still feature remarkable clarity, and the most passionate fans still dissect and relive that moment to this day. But in a strange confluence of disparate interests, these recordings have become equally intriguing to security analysts, network conspiracy theorists, and intelligence services. The reason is simple, and on the surface, seemingly innocuous. Footage taken of the game that night inadvertently captured another, smaller event. 13 minutes, 17 seconds before Gerard's winning goal, with the intensity and drama of the game at its height, a man in the crowd unexpectedly stood up from his seat. He gave a friendly wave to the stadium, was quickly flanked by his waiting associates, and then calmly yet promptly walked down the aisle before disappearing into the busy concourse. He would not return. Had it been anyone else in the crowd, the moment would have passed entirely unnoticed. But attending the game that night, and the man to unexpectedly leave, was General William Carter, Supreme Allied Commander of the Orion Treaty Organization. In the days that followed, a brief statement from Otto provided an explanation for General Carter's premature exit. Missile strikes on peacekeepers in the Apollo cluster had suddenly escalated, requiring that certain officials be recalled and immediately briefed. It was a serious situation, they claimed, but not cause for wider alarm. For most, this explanation was enough, but not all. Everywhere across the Orion Arm, there were signs something far more intense had just occurred. And it would take 20 years of investigations, leaks, and admissions before another, equally brief statement was made on the matter. It confirmed what many had long suspected. Moments before the winning goal in Game 6 of the 22-62 OHL playoffs, half the Orion Arm away, the trajectory of interstellar geopolitics had been dramatically altered. Tens of thousands of lives had just been lost. Dozens of starships were still burning in space, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the German Reich had only narrowly avoided going to war. Despite the basic admission from Otto that a major fleet action took place in the Vega System in 2262, no governmental agency from any nation has ever offered any details or evidence from which even a simple narrative of events might be constructed. It is only through the work of private or independent analysts that such a framework might be constructed. But in doing so, we must acknowledge the weaknesses of such an approach with its inherent gaps of knowledge and potential for bias.
What can be claimed with reasonable certainty is that by the summer of 2262, the tenure of Alton Nergui as both General Secretary and Premier atop Soviet leadership had reached its lowest ebb.
Prominent setbacks in the expansion of the Kazanjik Interstellar Combine had turned what was supposed to be a major component of the 58th five-year plan into a metaphor for the struggling national economy. And this was only the most visible symptom of far deeper systemic challenges. Since his ascendancy atop the government of the USSR in 2249, Nergui's domestic initiatives had been defined by political conservatism, neglect, and stagnation. Rollbacks of previous reforms and a lack of innovation had led to the unchecked expansion of the interstellar Soviet bureaucracy, with systemic inefficiencies, cronyism, and corruption. To retain his position, Negui had become dependent on a powerful faction of hardliners within the government, and especially a few prominent allies in control of key military institutions and security services. While domestic failures might not have been enough to threaten his support, Soviet foreign policy and the nation's position in the Orion Arm had been repeatedly hindered by missteps and miscalculations.
The Comintern was bleeding members, reduced by 28 states over Nergui's tenure.
With his credibility as statesman severely undermined, the reformist wing of the Communist Party was emboldened. It was within this political environment that the first plans were made to spark a confrontation with the German Reich. Soviet intent appears to have been to spark a surprise, powerful, but ultimately limited provocation. A quick, bloodless propaganda victory that could shore up Nergui's domestic support and demonstrate to the Comintern that the Soviet Union remained a formidable and committed partner in every region of the Orion Arm. The selection of the Vega planetary system as the desired site of this escalation also communicated Soviet intentions in a few significant ways. Originally one of the most powerful and influential extrasolar nations to emerge from the evacuation efforts, Vega had been an early symbol of pride and progress, at a time when most of mankind was still struggling to rebuild their transplanted societies. But a series of conflicts and foreign interventions had left the nation in ruins. In 2262, it was again an active war zone, split in half between the Republic of Vega and the Federal Union of Vega, the latter a new member of the Axis powers. But the conflict appeared to be nearing its end. Despite substantial material support and tens of thousands of military advisors from the Reich and other Axis nations, the fighting on Vega and its outlying star systems remained locked in a stalemate, with no decisive breakthrough likely by either side. Vega had become an embarrassment for the Reich, and it was now pursuing its own exit strategies and pressuring the Federal Union to negotiate an armistice. If a Soviet fleet could arrive undetected into this environment, a war zone in which the Reich might technically be seen as an active combatant, the propaganda value would be immense. The maneuver would expose the weaknesses of the Axis position and amplify the perceived loss of prestige associated with their imminent withdrawal. It would also be a major escalation, even if the only intent of the Soviet fleet was to perform a simple transit through the system as a non-belligerent nation. But any blowback would be contained, affecting only the nations and star systems of the local cluster, and unlikely to upset the far more volatile Soviet-German border territories in the Antares Gap. The Soviet government also certainly hoped that by confronting the Reich in Vega, they might leverage that system's historical significance, an important touchstone to many of the non-legacy nations in the region. Based on the scale of the operation, planning and forward redeployments of the Soviet Navy were likely conducted throughout the late summer of 2262. And it is almost a certainty that the operation was carried out between October 17th and 18th. Thousands of internal documents, testimonies, and recordings have leaked to darknets in the decades since, each purporting to be genuine in their accounts of what happened when the Soviet task force entered the system. But most have been discredited. There remains, however, a smaller, carefully vetted collection of evidence that cannot be so easily dismissed. From these fragments, dozens of different theories have emerged. The most widespread narrative asserts that the Soviet fleet entered the Vega system without incident. And despite the secretive nature of the operation, to avoid any unexpected escalation, it had in fact been carefully telegraphed through back channels to Reich officials once the group was underway. The Soviet force intended to complete an orbit on one of the system's outer planets, conduct a resupply with ships from the Navy of the Republic of Vega, and then depart. This was all to have been done in an uncontested part of the Vega planetary system, well away from the ongoing fighting. But at some point during the exercise, the Soviet fleet was suddenly required to divert from its original course. According to some sources, this change was to assist a Republican convoy that had experienced some sort of accident, having possibly struck a mine. It was during these emergency operations, while still well within the Republic of Vega's territory, that unidentified, unresponsive contacts appeared on the outer edge of the fleet's sensor coverage. As attempts were made to establish contact, these craft instead fired a salvo of advanced anti-ship munitions. Launched from extreme range with a generous window to intercept, a combination of interceptors and space defense missiles shot down the majority of the incoming fire, with close-in weapons systems neutralizing the remainder. Damage was minimal, but this action nevertheless forced the Soviet fleet to abandon its ongoing emergency efforts and reposition itself around the stricken convoy. In the aftermath of this attack, when confusion surrounding the developing situation was at its height, an additional line of far larger, still unidentifiable sensor contacts appeared at extreme range, on a bearing almost directly opposite to the initial missile strike. Operating on the assumption that these new contacts were the Republic of Vega's resupply force, the Soviet fleet allowed them to close while attempting to establish contact and simultaneously identify the nature of their previous attackers. At this point, the Soviet force reportedly believed it had been the victim of a friendly fire incident. Their inability to positively identify and communicate with Allied ships at longer distances had in fact been a common occurrence due to difficulties integrating Soviet and Vegan equipment. In an incident that had been quietly suppressed just weeks earlier, a Soviet vessel had mistakenly fired upon a Vegan drone ship. By the time Soviet interstellar warning and control craft had positively identified the incoming contacts as warships of the German Kriegsmarine, it was far too late for either side to disengage. A furious exchange of weapons fire erupted, though accounts contradict on which side fired the first salvo. Soviet naval doctrine, favoring heavy saturation attacks at extreme range, proved decisive. Though they had closed the distance significantly, the German warships still remained far too distant to employ their more advanced, shorter-range arsenals, and were simply unable to match the Soviets' missile for missile. Some reports claim that only 9 minutes after the first volley, the space in front of the German fleet had become so saturated by torpedo-deployed chaff, mines, and loitering munitions that their tracking systems were entirely overwhelmed. The success rate for the P-150 Rubin, the heaviest Soviet anti-ship missile in use at the time, supposedly climbed from a baseline 4% to 39%, an extraordinary record for an engagement taking place at that range. Damage to the Soviet fleet, by contrast, was concentrated across the formation's leading flank, where a battlecruiser squadron had momentarily entered the effective range of Kriegsmarine railguns. Engagements between aerospace and escort squadrons screening the two fleets continued for several hours afterward, but neither of the main battle lines made any attempt to re-engage the other. Casualties incurred by the Soviet fleet were 9 ships destroyed, 31 damaged, while the German formation experienced losses of as many as 40 ships destroyed and 80 damaged. In the weeks following the battle, once the threat of further escalation had been contained, investigations conducted by intelligence services in both nations determined that the German force had been composed of paramilitary units operating independently of the Reich's central command structure. Having not been included in the informal backchannels used by either government, they had acted on their own initiative, raising questions as to the extent of command and control that could be exercised inside the German military hierarchy. While this version of events suggests a reasonable possibility for what might have occurred, it is not without its detractors. Particular skepticism is directed towards the claimed involvement of partially rogue paramilitary forces. The theory that an entire Soviet battle group,
engaged in a carefully planned and communicated operation, would suddenly divert to assist a Republican convoy is likewise seen as highly improbable. An alternative, conflicting account provides a very different, though no less plausible version of events. It contends that, driven by desperation, General Secretary Nergui had desired to not only provoke the Axis powers, but humiliate them. A decisive show of force, it was believed, would fully cement his weakening position, and might even be enough to convince the Republic of Vega to assume full membership in the Comintern once the war in the system was over. To achieve this, the arrival of the Soviet battle group within the system would not be conducted in friendly, uncontested territory well outside the war zone, but carefully timed to facilitate the successful intercept of German interstellar assets. A Luftwaffe supply convoy of some 200 ships, one of the many German flotillas departing the system in preparation for the Axis withdrawal, was deemed an appropriate target. Upon selection, it was clandestinely tracked by Republican intelligence assets throughout the system. The Soviet fleet, meanwhile, meticulously pre-positioned in deep space to avoid German detection, would be periodically briefed as to the convoy's course and speed. The plan hinged on the Soviet battle group conducting a translight jump into the Vega System, just as the Luftwaffe convoy was crossing its outer markers. Facing a confrontation with a superior force, the German fleet would have no choice but to accede to Soviet demands and reroute. In practical military terms, this maneuver would be a near useless gesture, a mild frustration to the Germans, no different from the aggressive conduct commonly employed by navies looking to intimidate their rivals. But symbolically, the act would be almost unprecedented. A fleet of the Reich, even an empty supply convoy, forced by a foreign nation to alter their course within their own claimed sphere of influence, would be an extraordinary display of Soviet military planning and a far deeper blow to Axis prestige. To ensure total secrecy and give the operation every chance to succeed, the Soviet government would not signal its intentions through any of the dedicated back channels. Even once the operation was underway, German officials would receive no acknowledgement from any Soviet source as to the mission's scope, intent, or existence. Only after the successful intercept of the convoy would the operation be acknowledged. In this account of events, the Soviet incursion into Vega was a disaster nearly from the start. Unable to continuously monitor the Luftwaffe convoy without detection, Soviet intelligence assets in the system had been forced to rely on sporadic, passive surveillance and AI-assisted projections. And while their target was almost exactly where it was expected to be, right on the edge of the outer marker, the Soviet fleet had been entirely misled as to the nature of the ships opposite them. When the Soviet commander broadcast their demand that the German force reroute or face a boarding action, he believed he was addressing a mostly empty supply convoy and its scattered escorts. Instead, they were confronting a fully loaded flotilla of troop transports, containing over 30,000 Axis advisors. In place of the few expected scattered escorts, were premier elements of the Kriegsmarine's High Seas Fleet and Hungarian Space Forces. It was during the broadcast of the Germans' counter-demand that a Soviet capital ship, sometimes identified as the battlecruiser Zinoviev, struck a mine and suffered a major explosion. Believing his task force had just been fired upon, the Soviet commander ordered his ships to retaliate. Only minutes after entering the system, the largest interstellar fleet action in human history was now taking place, with as many as 500 warships across both sides. Across the battlespace, so many instances of electronic warfare were activated that the capabilities of both fleets were compromised. Even interfleet communications was sometimes affected, paralyzing Soviet captains and squadron commanders who relied upon centralized command and control. Though the engagement had opened at extreme range, a situation that in theory favored Soviet doctrine, the pervasive ECM had disrupted their ability to execute the necessary saturation attacks. Entire formations fired their salvos out of sequence, unable to coordinate their timing or targets. Once launched, hundreds of Soviet missiles were reportedly neutralized well before they reached their targets, forced into rapidly and perpetually cycling through their myriad of guidance options, and unable to achieve a lock for more than a few milliseconds. Others were jammed by their own onboard electronic countermeasures before spiraling out of control. German long-range missiles, by contrast, though not unaffected, proved more resilient at slicing through the interference, and were even able to jam Soviet close-in weapons systems. As both sides struggled to break through the interference, and more countermeasures were deployed, the identification of enemy targets in the battlespace became almost impossible. By the time each formation had begun to pass within 300 kilometers of the other, the more powerful German lasers had started to burn out the sensors of individual Soviet ships and feed back uncompromised targeting data. With this advantage, German railguns, prioritized within the Kriegsmarine, began to tear the Soviet fleet apart. German semi-armor-piercing thermobaric incendiary rounds, which would later gain infamy as firecracker rods during the Battle of the Argentine Moons, are sometimes said to have had their inaugural use during this phase of the engagement. Unable to be jammed and possessing a far greater accuracy and range than those of their opponents, the Axis forces inflicted sizable damage before Soviet targeting finally achieved parity. As both fleets completed their initial pass of one another, as many as 210 ships had been destroyed or damaged, the majority Soviet. Though far more detailed in its description of the course of the battle, this account too has its critics. The supposed ability of the Soviet Navy in 2262 to conduct a translight jump into a German supply corridor without being detected is especially challenged, as is how such a far more massive action could be kept suppressed, even within the infamously restrictive Soviet and German systems. Nearly every account of the fleet action off Vega reports that in the weeks following the battle, a massive effort was made at the highest levels of both nations to prevent an all-out war. The theories differ on why each side has elected to keep the details of the incident a secret, or what calculations influenced that decision. But until the Soviet archives or those of the Reich are open to the public, any report detailing the fleet action off Vega must be taken with a degree of circumspection. In all likelihood, no single account reflects the truth, and parsing which details are accurate and which have been distorted to fit a more desirable narrative is impossible. Even discussing the incident publicly is difficult, with any discourse held on the networks quickly infiltrated and manipulated by disinformation intelligences. Several governments and other entities are suspected to engage in this practice, a small part in the far greater, omnipresent shadow conflict waged in the information space to shape public opinion. But some things can be said with certainty, even if their connection to any fleet action near Vega is not. In 2263, Premier Nguyen was removed, and the reformist wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union obtained an unequaled level of control over their government. By 2265, every major power had announced a comprehensive review of warship design. The following year, the Republic of Vega formally joined the Comintern. And as of 2285, the Vega planetary system remains one of the most dangerous places in the Orion Arm, the only theater where events have transpired so that the Soviet Union and German Reich no longer face each other across the vast gulf of space, but bayonet to bayonet.